The crash. The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the Moldov desert, its relentless heat shimmering off the cracked earth. Zephyr, a former Navy SEAL, wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting against the glare as he trudged across the barren landscape. His canteen hung half-empty at his hip, a stark reminder to ration carefully during his weekly supply run. Years of combat had honed his senses to a razor's edge, and those instincts flared to life when a distant rumble reached his ears. He froze, scanning the horizon. "What the hell?" Zephyr muttered it as a plume of dust rose in the distance. His heart rate quickened as he watched a blazing object tear across the sky, leaving a trail of smoke. It wasn't a meteor. The trajectory was too controlled, too purposeful. The object crashed beyond a nearby ridge with a thunderous impact, shaking the ground beneath his feet. Curiosity walled with caution as Zephyr debated his next move. The isolation of the desert had been his refuge from the chaos of the world, but old habits died hard. With a resigned sigh, he altered course toward the crash site. As he crested the ridge, his breath caught in his throat. A sleek metallic craft lay half buried in the sand, unlike any aircraft he'd ever seen. Its alien design left no doubt. This was not of Earth. "Holy, holy," Zephyr breathed, approaching cautiously. The sound of panicked voices drew his attention. A small group of hikers were fleeing the scene, their faces etched with terror. Zephyr's brow furrowed as he noticed the object of their fear, a small humanoid figure stumbling away from the wreckage. His training kicked in as he assessed the situation. The creature was clearly injured, its movements unsteady. When it turned, Zephyr's eyes widened in shock. Its skin was nearly transparent, pulsing with an ethereal inner light. Despite its alien appearance, there was something undeniably childlike about its proportions and movements. While others ran, Zephyr found himself drawn forward. The creature, no, the child, locked eyes with him. In that moment, all thoughts of self-preservation vanished. He saw only a scared, hurt kid who needed help. "Hey there," Zephyr called softly, approaching with his hands raised. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." The alien child tilted its head, studying him with huge, luminous eyes. It took a hesitant step forward before its legs gave out. Zephyr lunged, catching the small form before it hit the ground. Up close, the alien's uniqueness was even more apparent. Its skin was cool to the touch with a faint electric tingle. Zephyr could see the rhythmic pulsing of what he assumed were internal organs, glowing with an otherworldly light. "You're in rough shape, kid," Zephyr murmured. He glanced at the crashed ship, then back at the alien child. "Where's the rest of your crew?" The child made a soft, keening sound that tugged at Zephyr's heart. He didn't need to understand the language to recognize grief. The wail of approaching sirens snapped Zephyr back to reality. He cursed under his breath, knowing the government would be all over this in minutes. His mind raced, weighing his options. "Ah, hell," he muttered. "I'm probably going to regret this." With a decisive nod, Zephyr scooped up the alien child and began making his way back toward his hidden shelter. He had barely made it 100 yards when the first black SUVs came roaring over the ridge. "Halt, this is a restricted area," a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. Zephyr's muscles coiled, ready to sprint, but a pitiful whimper from the child in his arms made him hesitate. He turned slowly, keeping the alien partially shielded behind him. A stern-faced man in a crisp military uniform approached, flanked by armed soldiers. "I'm Colonel Hawkins. You need to hand over the extraterrestrial immediately." Zephyr's jaw clenched. "With all due respect, sir, this is a child. It needs medical attention, not to be treated like a lab experiment." Hawkins' eyes narrowed. "That's not your call to make, civilian. We have protocols in place for first contact scenarios." "Yeah, I bet you do," Zephyr scoffed. "The kind that involve dissection tables in secret facilities, right?" The colonel's hand twitched toward his sidearm. "Final warning. Hand it over, or we'll be forced to take it by any means necessary." Zephyr's combat-honed instincts screamed danger. In one fluid motion, he spun and sprinted for the nearby rock formation. Gunshots peppered the ground at his heels as he zigzagged, using the terrain for cover. His lungs burned as he pushed himself to the limit, the alien child clutched tightly to his chest. Zephyr's intimate knowledge of the desert landscape was his only advantage. He ducked into a narrow crevice, pressing himself against the cool stone as voices shouted in the distance. The alien child trembled in his arms, its glow noticeably dimmer than before. "Hang in there, kid," Zephyr whispered. "I'm going to figure this out." As the sound of searching soldiers grew closer, Zephyr's mind raced. He needed a plan, and fast. The network of caves he called home might offer temporary shelter, but it was only a matter of time before they were found. A faint buzzing drew his attention. Zephyr's eyes widened as he noticed his watch and phone vibrating erratically. The alien child reached out a delicate hand, seemingly drawn to the devices. "Wait, do you feed on electromagnetic waves?" Zephyr muttered, the pieces clicking into place. The child's eyes met his, a flicker of understanding passing between them. Zephyr nodded, a plan forming. "All right, kid. I think I know how to help you, but we're going to have to make a run for it. You ready?" The alien child gripped his shirt tightly in response. Zephyr took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "Here goes nothing," he muttered and burst from their hiding spot. The desert erupted into chaos as Zephyr sprinted across the open terrain. Shouts and gunfire filled the air, but he pushed through the fear, focused solely on his goal. The alien child clung to him, its glow pulsing weakly. Zephyr's legs burned as he pushed himself to the limit, weaving between rock formations and cacti. He could hear the roar of engines as military vehicles gave chase. His hidden bunker was close, but the pursuing forces were gaining ground rapidly. Just as it seemed they might be overtaken, Zephyr spotted a familiar outcropping. With a final burst of speed, he ducked behind it, revealing a cleverly concealed entrance. He practically dove inside, slamming the reinforced door shut behind them. The bunker was sparse but functional, filled with survival gear and electronic equipment. Zephyr gently set the alien child down, his hands flying over various devices. "All right, kid," he panted. "Let's see if this works." He activated every piece of equipment he had, filling the small space with a cacophony of electromagnetic waves. The effect on the alien was immediate. Its glow brightened, and it reached out eagerly toward the devices. Zephyr allowed himself a small smile of triumph. "There you go, eat up." As the alien child absorbed the energy, Zephyr's mind raced. He knew this was only a temporary solution. The military would find them eventually, and the alien needed far more power than his jury-rigged setup could provide. A memory tugged at the edges of his consciousness. Whispered rumors from his SEAL days of a top-secret facility hidden in the Nevada desert, a place where experimental technology pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Zephyr's jaw set with determination. It was a long shot, but it might be the alien child's only chance at survival. "Looks like we're going on a road trip, kid," he murmured. The pounding on the bunker door grew more insistent. Zephyr knew their time was running out. He gathered what supplies he could, his mind already plotting their next move. As he scooped up the now stronger alien child, Zephyr caught his reflection in a cracked mirror. The haunted look that had plagued him since leaving the SEALs was gone, replaced by a fierce determination. For the first time in years, he had a purpose again, and come hell or high water, he was going to see it through. "All right, kid," Zephyr said, his voice steady. "Let's go save your life." With that, he activated the bunker's hidden escape tunnel, plunging them into darkness as they began their dangerous journey into the unknown. The road to survival, the hidden escape tunnel spat Zephyr and his alien charge out into the unforgiving mother of night. Stars glittered coldly overhead as he oriented himself, the weight of their predicament settling heavily on his shoulders. The secret military base he had heard rumors about lay hundreds of miles to the north, a journey fraught with danger even under ideal circumstances. "We've got a long road ahead, kid," Zephyr muttered, adjusting his grip on the small alien. Its luminous eyes blinked up at him, a mixture of fear and trust that made his chest tighten. "But I promise I'll get you there." He set off at a brisk pace, sticking to the shadows cast by towering rock formations. The desert's nighttime chill nipped at his exposed skin, a stark contrast to the day's blistering heat. Behind them, faint shouts and the distant hum of helicopters reminded him of the relentless pursuit. Zephyr's military training took over as he moved through the terrain with practiced ease, scanning for signs of trouble. The alien child clung to him, its body still faintly glowing, a beacon in the darkness. He would need to find a way to cover that light if they were to avoid detection. An idea struck him as they passed a weathered yucca plant. He paused, carefully plucking a few long, fibrous leaves. With quick, deft movements, Zephyr fashioned a crude sling to carry the child against his chest, using the yucca fibers to create a makeshift hood that obscured the glow. "There we go," Zephyr whispered, adjusting the hood over the alien's head. The light dimmed, casting only a faint glow that blended with the moonlight. "This should keep you hidden for now." As they pressed on, Zephyr's thoughts raced. The military's presence meant they weren't the only ones aware of the alien's arrival. His mind conjured images of black ops teams, shadowy government agents, and worse, groups willing to do anything to control or exploit the extraterrestrial visitor. They needed transportation, and soon. Zephyr knew they couldn't rely on hitching a ride. Too risky. Stealing a vehicle was the best option, but it had to be something discreet, something that wouldn't draw attention. Hours passed as they navigated the rugged terrain. The night sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn when Zephyr spotted what he had been hoping for, a small, dusty road cutting through the desert. And there, parked just off the road, was an old pickup truck, its paint faded and rusted from years of exposure. "Jackpot," Zephyr whispered. He approached cautiously, scanning the area for signs of the owner. The truck appeared abandoned, but Zephyr knew better than to let his guard down. He gently set the alien child down, instructing it to stay hidden as he crept toward the vehicle. The truck's door creaked loudly in the pre-dawn silence as Zephyr eased it open. The interior was cluttered with fast food wrappers and old maps, but the keys were still in the ignition. He let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. They had just caught a break. Zephyr quickly checked the fuel gauge, half a tank. It would be enough to get them a decent distance before they had to worry about refueling. He motioned for the alien child to join him, lifting it into the passenger seat and buckling the seatbelt. The child's wide eyes took in the truck's interior, curiosity momentarily eclipsing its fear. "First ride in a human vehicle, huh?" Zephyr said with a small smile. The alien made a soft chirping sound, which Zephyr took as a sign of agreement. He turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life with a cough and a groan. Zephyr winced, hoping the sound hadn't carried too far. With practiced hands, he shifted into gear and guided the truck onto the road, keeping his foot light on the gas pedal to minimize noise. As they drove, the desert scenery passed by in a blur of orange and red, the rising sun casting long shadows across the land. Zephyr kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs of pursuit. So far, they were in the clear, but he knew it wouldn't last. They needed to reach the outskirts of civilization before the military cordoned off the area. Zephyr's mind raced with possibilities: old contacts, safe houses, places they could lie low and regroup. But most of his former allies were either too far away or too deep in hiding themselves. They were on their own. A flash of movement on the horizon caught his attention. Zephyr squinted, trying to make out the shape. His breath caught when he recognized the distinctive silhouette of a drone, its sleek form skimming the desert floor like a predatory bird. The military wasn't far behind. Zephyr cursed under his breath, pressing down on the gas. The truck lurched forward, its engine protesting loudly. He couldn't risk heading into populated areas now. They'd have to lose the drone first. He veered off the road, tires kicking up a cloud of dust as they barreled across the open desert. The drone followed, its sensors undoubtedly locking onto the vehicle. Zephyr's mind worked furiously, scanning the landscape for anything that could offer cover. A narrow canyon loomed ahead, its jagged walls providing the perfect escape route. Zephyr swerved into the canyon's entrance, the truck's tires skidding on loose gravel. The drone hovered at the canyon's mouth, hesitating as if assessing whether to follow. Zephyr took advantage of the momentary hesitation, weaving through the canyon's twists and turns. The narrow passageway would make it difficult for the drone to maintain a lock, but they weren't out of the woods yet. The alien child clung to the seatbelt, its eyes wide with fear as the truck bounced over rocks and ruts. Zephyr gritted his teeth, pushing the old vehicle to its limits. The canyon walls towered above them, blocking out the sky. The drone's ominous buzz faded into the distance as they plunged deeper into the labyrinthine maze of stone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the canyon opened up into a wide, hidden valley. Zephyr slowed the truck to a stop, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "We made it," he whispered, more to himself than the alien child. At least for now. The valley was secluded, surrounded by towering rock formations that provided natural cover. Zephyr knew they couldn't stay long, but it would give them a chance to rest and regroup. He turned to the alien child, who was still trembling slightly from the harrowing chase. Zephyr reached out, gently placing a hand on its shoulder. "We're going to be okay," he said softly. "I promised I'd protect you, and I'm not going back on that." The alien's wide eyes met his, and for a moment, Zephyr thought he saw a flicker of a smile, a small but undeniable sign of trust. Zephyr leaned back in his seat, letting out a long breath. The road ahead was still fraught with danger, but they had survived this far. He knew they couldn't let their guard down, but for the first time since the crash, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. With the sun climbing higher in the sky, Zephyr knew they had to keep moving. But as he started the truck's engine once more, a new sense of determination settled over him. He had been drifting, lost in a world that no longer made sense. But now, with his alien child in his care, he had a purpose. And he wasn't going to let anything, or anyone, stand in his way. A new alliance. Zephyr drove through the valley, the truck's tires crunching over the rocky terrain. The alien child sat beside him, its eyes wide as it watched the landscape pass by. Though still nervous, the fear that had gripped the child seemed to be slowly giving way to curiosity. Zephyr glanced at the child, wondering what kind of life it had led before finding itself stranded on Earth. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Zephyr knew they needed to find shelter before the desert heat became unbearable. The valley provided some protection from the sun, but they couldn't stay out in the open for long. He scanned the area, looking for anything that might offer cover. Eventually, he spotted a cluster of large boulders nestled against the base of a cliff. They were partially shaded, and the rocks formed a sort of natural alcove, just large enough to hide the truck and themselves from aerial surveillance. Zephyr pulled the truck into the alcove, killing the engine as they came to a stop. He climbed out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel, and motioned for the alien child to follow. The child hesitated for a moment before scrambling out of the truck, clutching Zephyr's hand as they approached the boulders. "We'll rest here for a bit," Zephyr said, patting one of the large stones. "It's not much, but it should keep us hidden until nightfall." The child nodded, its faint glow dimming further in the shadow of the cliff. Zephyr noticed that the glow seemed to pulse slightly, almost in sync with the child's breathing. It was as if the light was tied to its emotions, brighter when scared, softer when calm. Zephyr sat down on a flat rock and began rummaging through his backpack, pulling out a canteen of water and a few ration bars. He handed one to the child, who eyed it curiously before taking a cautious bite. The alien's face scrunched up in distaste, but it continued chewing. "Yeah, I know," Zephyr said with a chuckle. "Not exactly gourmet, but it'll keep you going." As they ate, Zephyr's thoughts drifted to the situation they were in. He was on the run with an alien child, hunted by forces he didn't fully understand. The military presence in the area suggested that the government was involved, but Zephyr had no idea what they wanted with the child or how far they would go to get it back. He needed answers, and fast. But more than that, he needed allies. Zephyr had always preferred to work alone, but this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the safety of the child, and possibly more if the situation escalated. He glanced down at the child, who was now carefully examining the remains of the ration bar, as if trying to figure out what exactly it was made of. Zephyr couldn't help but smile at the sight. The child's innocence was a stark contrast to the dangers they were facing. Zephyr took a deep breath and made a decision. There was someone he could contact, an old friend who had gone off the grid years ago. They had worked together in the past, and if anyone could help them, it was her. The problem was, he had no idea if she was even still alive, let alone where she might be. But he had to try. He owed it to the child. "Listen," Zephyr said, catching the child's attention. "I know someone who might be able to help us, but it's going to be a long shot." The child tilted its head, clearly not understanding the specifics, but sensing the importance of what Zephyr was saying. "We'll rest here until nightfall," Zephyr continued, "and then we'll move. I'll need to send out a signal, a message. It's risky, but we don't have much choice." The child seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation, its glow pulsing a bit brighter as it nodded. Zephyr stood up and began to prepare. He couldn't risk using any conventional communication methods. They'd be too easily traced. Instead, he pulled out an old handheld radio, one he had modified years ago to operate on frequencies most people didn't even know existed. It was a relic from his time in the military, but it had never failed him. He tuned the radio to a specific frequency, hoping against hope that his contact still monitored it. Taking a deep breath, he began to tap out a message in Morse code, a language they had used back when encrypted communication was in its infancy. "SOS Zephyr, urgent." He sent the message 3 times, then switched off the radio, his heart pounding in his chest. All they could do now was wait and hope that the message reached its intended recipient. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Zephyr's anxiety grew. What if she didn't get the message? What if she was no longer monitoring the frequency? Or worse, what if the wrong people picked up the signal? But just as he was about to give in to despair, the radio crackled to life. A burst of static filled the air, followed by a familiar voice, distorted but unmistakable. "Zephyr, is that really you?" Relief flooded through Zephyr as he grabbed the radio. "Yeah, it's me. I need your help. I'm in deep." There was a pause on the other end, then the voice responded, more serious this time. "Where are you?" Zephyr quickly relayed their location, glancing at the child who was watching him intently. "Stay put," the voice instructed. "I'll be there as soon as I can. And Zephyr, be careful. There's a lot going on that you don't know about." The radio went silent, leaving Zephyr alone with his thoughts. He stared at the device for a moment before putting it away. Help was on the way, but the voice's warning echoed in his mind. What exactly was he getting into? He turned to the child, who was now resting against one of the boulders, its eyes half closed in exhaustion. Zephyr sat down beside it, gently adjusting the makeshift hood to keep the glow hidden. "Just a little longer," he whispered. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we're getting there." The child looked up at him, and Zephyr felt a strange connection forming between them, a bond that transcended words or species. Whatever happened next, they were in it together. As the night deepened, the valley grew quiet, the only sound being the distant call of nocturnal creatures. Zephyr kept his eyes on the horizon, waiting for the first sign of his old friend. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Zephyr felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. Into the unknown. The night sky was clear, with stars twinkling above like 1,000 tiny beacons. Zephyr's breath was steady as he kept watch, his senses on high alert. Every rustle of the wind, every distant animal call seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. The alien child slept peacefully beside him, its glow dimmed to almost nothing, hidden beneath the makeshift hood. Time dragged on, and the silence began to weigh heavily on Zephyr. He knew his friend would come. She had never let him down before, but the waiting was grueling. His thoughts kept circling back to the message she had sent. There's a lot going on that you don't know about. What did she mean? How deep did this rabbit hole go? Suddenly, Zephyr's ears picked up a faint hum in the distance. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but growing steadily louder. He squinted into the darkness, his heart pounding. The hum grew into a low drone, unmistakably the sound of an approaching vehicle. Zephyr's hand instinctively moved to the holster at his side, ready to defend the child if necessary. But then, as the vehicle came into view, he saw it, a sleek, black hovercraft, its lights dimmed to near invisibility. The craft was unlike anything Zephyr had ever seen, a blend of advanced human and alien technology. It moved silently through the air, hovering just above the ground as it approached their hiding spot. Zephyr's grip on his weapon relaxed slightly. He knew this was his friend, only she would have access to something like that. As the craft came to a stop a few yards away, the hatch slid open with a soft hiss, and a figure stepped out. She was tall and slender, her movements smooth and deliberate. Dressed in dark tactical gear, she seemed to blend into the shadows, her face hidden behind a high-tech visor. But Zephyr recognized her immediately. "Sandra," he said, a hint of relief in his voice. Sandra removed her visor, revealing sharp, intelligent eyes that scanned the area before settling on Zephyr. "You always did know how to get yourself into trouble," she said with a wry smile. Zephyr chuckled, though the tension in his shoulders didn't completely ease. "Trouble seems to follow me around," he replied, gesturing toward the child. "This time it brought me some company." Sandra's eyes flicked to the child, her expression softening as she took in the sight of the small, exhausted alien. She knelt down beside it, her tone gentle. "Hey there, little one," she said quietly. "You've had a rough time, haven't you?" The child stirred, blinking up at Sandra with wide, curious eyes. For a moment, the fear that had clouded its expression earlier seemed to melt away, replaced by a sense of safety in Sandra's presence. "Is it okay?" Sandra asked, glancing up at Zephyr. "For now," Zephyr replied. "But we're not out of the woods yet. What's going on, Sandra? Why is the government after this child?" Sandra stood up, her face serious. "It's complicated, Zephyr. There's more at play here than just the government. There are factions, some human, some alien, who see this child as the key to something much bigger. They think it has the power to unlock technology that could change the balance of power in the galaxy." Zephyr frowned. "What kind of technology?" Sandra shook her head. "I'm not entirely sure, but the rumors are enough to have everyone scrambling. Weapons, energy sources, communication networks, whatever it is, it's something they're willing to kill for." Zephyr's mind raced. He had known that taking the child meant stepping into dangerous territory, but this was far beyond anything he had anticipated. "And what about you?" he asked. "Whose side are you on?" Sandra gave him a long, measured look. "I'm on your side, Zephyr. You know that. But I have to be careful. There are people out there who would do anything to get their hands on this child, and if they find out I'm helping you." Zephyr nodded, understanding the unspoken implications. "Then we have to stay ahead of them. Do you have a plan?" Sandra glanced at the hovercraft. "We need to get out of here fast. There's a safe house a few hours from here, deep in the mountains. It's off the grid, and we can lay low there while we figure out our next move." Zephyr hesitated, looking back at the child. "Is it safe?" "As safe as anywhere can be right now," Sandra replied. "We don't have much choice, Zephyr. They're going to keep coming, and we need to be ready." He knew she was right. The open desert offered no protection, and every minute they spent out in the open was another minute they risked being found. "All right," he said finally, "let's go." Sandra nodded and moved quickly, helping Zephyr lift the child into the hovercraft. Once they were inside, she powered up the controls, and the craft hummed to life, rising smoothly into the air. The interior was dimly lit, with advanced instrumentation that Zephyr barely recognized. Sandra's hands moved expertly over the controls as they sped away from the valley, the hovercraft gliding silently through the night. As they traveled, Zephyr kept his eyes on the landscape below, the barren desert giving way to rugged mountains. The child sat beside him, leaning against his arm, its faint glow casting a soft light in the cavern. Despite the danger they were in, Zephyr felt a strange sense of calm. Sandra was one of the few people he trusted, and knowing she was with them gave him a renewed sense of purpose. After what felt like hours, the hovercraft began to descend, weaving through a narrow mountain pass. The safe house was hidden deep within the cliffs, almost invisible from above. As they approached, a hidden door slid open in the rock face, revealing a hangar large enough to accommodate the craft. Sandra guided the hovercraft inside, and the door closed behind them, sealing them in complete darkness. For a moment, Zephyr's breath caught in his throat, the silence pressing down on him. But then lights flickered on, illuminating the hangar and revealing a small, well-equipped base. "Welcome to my little hideaway," Sandra said with a hint of pride as she powered down the hovercraft. Zephyr climbed out, taking in the sight of the base. It was compact but well-organized, with everything they could need to survive off the grid: supplies, weapons, medical equipment, and even a small living space. Sandra led them to a room with a cot, where she gently laid the child down. "Let it rest," she said quietly. "It's been through a lot." Zephyr nodded, watching as the child curled up on the cot, its glow dimming as it drifted back to sleep. He turned to Sandra, his expression serious. "What's our next move?" Sandra sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We need to figure out who's after the child and why. There are a few contacts I can reach out to, people who might have more information. But we have to be careful. If word gets out that we're here, we'll handle it," Zephyr said, his voice firm. "We've been through worse." Sandra gave him a small smile. "True, but this time we're not just fighting for ourselves." Zephyr looked back at the sleeping child, a sense of responsibility settling over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they had to protect the child at all costs. The fate of more than just their lives might depend on it. As the night wore on, Zephyr and Sandra began to make plans, preparing for the battles they knew were coming. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were in this together, and they wouldn't stop until they uncovered the truth. In the stillness of the mountains, the safe house offered a brief respite from the storm, but Zephyr knew it wouldn't last. The forces hunting them were relentless, and sooner or later, they would catch up. But when they did, Zephyr would be ready. They all would, the calm before the storm. The sun was just beginning to rise over the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. Inside the safe house, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Zephyr, Sandra, and the alien child was safe for now, but they all knew that their time was running out. Zephyr was already up, pacing the small living area as he reviewed their plans. The safe house was well stocked and secure, but it was only a temporary refuge. They needed to make their next move before their enemies caught up with them. Sandra sat at a small table, her eyes glued to a series of holographic screens floating in front of her. Her fingers moved quickly over the controls, accessing encrypted communications channels and tapping into underground networks of information. She was trying to piece together the puzzle of who was after the child and why. The child, still exhausted from the journey and the stress of the past few days, slept soundly in a cot in the corner of the room. Its soft glow had returned, a sign that it was beginning to recover, but it was still too weak to move on its own. Zephyr stopped pacing and walked over to Sandra, looking over her shoulder at the screens. "Anything?" he asked. Xandra shook her head, her brow furrowed in concentration. A lot of noise, but nothing concrete yet. Whoever's behind, this is covering their tracks well. But there's something. Zephyr leaned in closer. What is it? There's been a spike in encrypted transmissions in this sector over the last few days, Xandra explained. It's unusual. Too much chatter for an area that's supposed to be off the grid. It could be a coincidence, but... Zephyr nodded. But it could also mean they're getting close. Xandra sighed, leaning back in her chair. That's what I'm afraid of. We might have less time than we thought. Zephyr felt a knot of tension form in his stomach. They had been running on borrowed time since they took the child, and now it seemed that time was about to run out. What's our next move? We need to go on the offensive, Xandra replied. If we keep waiting for them to come to us, we'll be outnumbered and outgunned. But if we can hit them first, disrupt their operations, we might buy ourselves enough time to figure out what they're really after. Sapphire considered her words carefully. It was a risky plan, but it was the kind of risk they had taken before, and Xandra was right. Waiting for their enemies to find them wasn't an option. All right, he said finally. What do you need from me? Xandra smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. I've got a few leads I want to follow up on. There's an abandoned research facility not too far from here. Rumor has it some of the factions after the child were using it as a base. If we can get in and find out what they are working on, it might give us the upper hand. Zephyr nodded. And you think it's still operational? Only one way to find out, Xandra replied. But we'll need to move fast. We can't leave the child unprotected for too long. Zephyr glanced over at the sleeping child. It seemed so small and vulnerable, but he knew it held the key to something much larger than any of them. We'll make it quick, he said. Xandra stood up, stretching her arms. Good. I'll prep the hovercraft. You make sure the child is ready to move if we need to get out of here in a hurry. As Xandra moved to the hangar, Zephyr approached the child's cot. He knelt down beside it, watching as its chest rose and fell with each breath. Despite everything, there was an innocence about the child that struck Zephyr. It had been thrust into a situation far beyond its understanding, and yet it had managed to survive. Gently, he reached out and placed a hand on the child's shoulder. Hey, he said softly, we're going to have to go on a little trip. It might be dangerous, but I promise I'll keep you safe. The child stirred, its eyes fluttering open. For a moment, it looked up at Zephyr with confusion, but then recognition settled in, and it gave a small nod. Zephyr smiled, relieved to see the child was still with him mentally. Good, he said. We'll get through this together. As the child sat up, Zephyr helped it to its feet. It was still weak, but it managed to stand with his support. The glow emanating from its body was brighter now, a sign that its strength was slowly returning. By the time Zephyr and the child made their way to the hangar, Xandra was already running final checks on the hovercraft. She looked up as they approached, giving them an encouraging nod. Ready to go. Zephyr helped the child into the hovercraft, securing it in a seat next to his own. As ready as we'll ever be, he replied. Xandra finished her checks and climbed into the pilot's seat, powering up the craft. The engines hummed to life, and the hangar doors began to slide open, revealing the rugged landscape beyond. As they lifted off, Zephyr couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. But there was no turning back now. The only way out was forward. The hovercraft moved swiftly through the narrow mountain pass, following a route that Xandra had carefully mapped out. The research facility was located deep in the mountains, far from any civilization, but Xandra had assured Zephyr that it was within reach. As they flew, the tension in the air was palpable. Zephyr kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for any signs of trouble. The mountains loomed large around them, their peaks shrouded in mist, creating an eerie atmosphere that only heightened the sense of impending danger. After what felt like an eternity, the facility came into view. It was a large, imposing structure built into the side of the mountain, with a series of landing pads and access points scattered across its surface. Despite its size, the facility appeared abandoned, with no lights or signs of activity. But Zephyr knew better than to let his guard down. "Are you sure it's empty?" he asked. Sandra narrowed her eyes, focusing on the facility's layout. "I'm sure it's not," she said, "but we don't have a choice. We need whatever information they've left behind." Zephyr nodded, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. "Then let's do this." Sandra guided the hovercraft to one of the landing pads, bringing it down with practiced precision. As they disembarked, the silence of the facility was almost deafening. The air was still, the only sound coming from the distant wind that whipped through the mountain pass. Zephyr took point, leading the way toward the facility's main entrance. Sandra stayed close behind, with the child between them, its small form dwarfed by the towering structure. The entrance was sealed, but Sandra quickly bypassed the security protocols, her fingers flying over the control panel. With a soft hiss, the doors slid open, revealing a dimly lit corridor that stretched deep into the mountain. "Stay close," Zephyr said, his voice low as they stepped inside. The facility was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, each one more foreboding than the last. The walls were lined with inactive machinery, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and disuse. But there was something else too, a sense of unease that clung to the very atmosphere, as if the facility itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As they moved deeper into the facility, Sandra accessed a series of terminals, searching for any data that might give them a clue about what had been happening here. Zephyr kept watch, his senses on high alert, ready to react to any threat that might emerge. Finally, Sandra found something. "Here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've got something. Logs, research files. This is big, Zephyr." Zephyr moved to her side, scanning the data on the terminal. What he saw made his blood run cold. The facility had been researching advanced alien technologies, specifically technologies related to the child's species. The logs detailed experiments, some successful, others horrific failures. The data was vast, but one thing was clear: the child was more important than they had ever imagined. "They were trying to harness the child's abilities," Sandra said, her voice filled with disbelief. "Energy manipulation, teleportation, even biological enhancements. But they couldn't control it. Every experiment ended in disaster." Zephyr's mind raced as he processed the information. The factions hunting them weren't just after the child, they wanted to weaponize it, and they were willing to go to any lengths to do so. "We need to get this data out of here," Sandra said urgently. "If we can expose this, it might turn the tide in our favor." But before Zephyr could respond, the facility's alarms suddenly blared to life, filling the air with a deafening wail. Red lights flashed throughout the corridors, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the halls. "We're out of time," Zephyr said, grabbing Sandra's arm. "We need to move, now." They bolted from the terminal, the child in tow, as the facility's defenses activated. Automated turrets emerged from the walls, tracking their movements, and the sound of boots on metal grew louder, signaling the arrival of enemy forces. Zephyr led the way, his weapon at the ready as they fought their way back to the hovercraft. The corridors seemed to stretch on forever, each turn revealing new dangers, but Zephyr's determination never wavered. They had come too far to fail now. Finally, they reached the landing pad, the hovercraft waiting for them with its engines idling. But as they approached, a squad of heavily armed soldiers emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. Zephyr didn't hesitate. He unleashed a barrage of fire, taking out the first wave of soldiers before they could react. Sandra covered him, her own weapon blazing as she provided suppressive fire. The child huddled close to Zephyr, its eyes wide with fear, but trusting him completely. With the soldiers temporarily driven back, they made a break for the hovercraft. Zephyr helped the child aboard, while Sandra kept the enemies at bay, her shots precise and deadly. But the soldiers were relentless, and more were closing in from all sides. "We're not going to make it," Zandra shouted over the noise of battle. "We have to," Zephyr shouted back, firing another burst of shots. "Get us out of here." Zandra didn't need to be told twice. She dove into the pilot's seat, slamming the controls and lifting the hovercraft off the ground. The engines roared to life, and the craft shot forward, narrowly avoiding the soldiers' fire. As they sped away from the facility, the mountains echoed with the sounds of battle, but Zephyr knew that this was just the beginning. The data they had retrieved was valuable, but it had also painted a target on their backs. And now there was no turning back. The storm was coming, and they were at its very center. The gathering storm. The hovercraft raced through the mountains, its engines humming with the strain of the high-speed escape. Zephyr and Zandra sat in tense silence, their minds racing with the implications of the data they had uncovered. The child, exhausted from the ordeal, had fallen asleep in Zephyr's arms, its small form curled against him. As the rugged landscape zipped by beneath them, Zephyr couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The data they had retrieved was a treasure trove of information, but it had also confirmed their worst fears. The factions hunting the child were more powerful and more ruthless than they had imagined. "We need to find a way to get this data to the right people," Zandra said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was a hard edge to it, a determination that matched the fire in her eyes. Zephyr nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Agreed, but who can we trust? Every contact we've had could be compromised." Zandra considered his question for a moment, her fingers tapping out a rhythmic pattern on the console. "There's one person," she said finally. "An old ally of mine, Captain Rhea. She's been off the grid for years, running a small fleet of independent ships. If anyone can help us, it's her." Zephyr looked at Zandra, searching her face for any signs of doubt. "You think she'll help?" Zandra met his gaze, her expression resolute. "She owes me a favor. And she's got the resources to keep us hidden long enough to figure out our next move." "Then let's do it," Zephyr said, leaning back in his seat. "Get us to her." Andra nodded and began inputting coordinates into the hovercraft's navigation system. The craft adjusted its course, veering toward a less traveled part of the mountain range. The journey would be long, but with any luck, they'd reach Captain Rhea before their enemies could catch up. Hours passed as the hovercraft wove through the mountains, the jagged peaks gradually giving way to rolling hills and dense forests. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, when a signal appeared on the craft's console, an encrypted communication bearing Rhea's signature. Zandra opened the channel, her voice steady as she spoke. "This is Zandra. I'm inbound with critical cargo, requesting clearance and safe harbor." There was a pause, then a voice crackled through the speakers. "Zandra, long time. You've got clearance. Sending coordinates now." A small smile tugged at Zandra's lips as the new coordinates appeared on the screen. "Thanks, Rhea. We'll be there soon." Zephyr felt a sense of relief wash over him. If Zandra trusted Rhea, then they had a real chance at making it through this. He glanced down at the child, still sleeping soundly in his arms, and vowed to do whatever it took to protect it. The hovercraft continued its journey, following the new coordinates deeper into the wilderness. After another hour of flying, they finally reached their destination, a secluded valley hidden from view by thick forests and steep cliffs. At the center of the valley was a small, heavily fortified compound. Several ships were docked around it, their sleek designs blending seamlessly with the natural surroundings. This was Rhea's base of operations, and it was clear she had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden from prying eyes. Zandra brought the hovercraft down on one of the landing pads, the engines powering down with a low whine. As the craft settled, a group of armed figures emerged from the compound, led by a tall woman with short-cropped silver hair and a commanding presence. "Zandra," the woman said, her voice carrying easily across the distance, "you always did know how to make an entrance." Sandra stepped out of the hovercraft, her usual guarded demeanor softening slightly as she greeted the woman. "Rhea, it's good to see you." Rhea smiled, though her eyes quickly shifted to the child in Zephyr's arms. "So this is the cargo," she said, her tone turning serious. "You weren't kidding when you said it was critical." Zephyr nodded, stepping forward. "The child is the key to everything, and there are people out there willing to do anything to get their hands on it." Rhea's expression hardened. "Then you've come to the right place. No one's getting in here without my say-so." She turned to her crew, giving them a nod. "Get them inside. We've got a lot to talk about." The crew quickly moved to escort Zephyr, Sandra, and the child into the compound. The interior was just as fortified as the exterior, with thick walls, state-of-the-art security systems, and enough firepower to hold off a small army. But it wasn't just a bunker, there were signs of life here too. Gardens with fresh produce, communal areas where the crew could relax, and living quarters that were both functional and comfortable. Rhea led them to a briefing room, where a large table was already set with maps, data terminals, and other resources. She gestured for them to sit, then activated the room's holo-display, bringing up a three-dimensional map of the region. "Start from the beginning," Rhea said, looking between Zephyr and Sandra. "I need to know everything if I'm going to help you." Over the next hour, they recounted their journey, from the moment they discovered the child to their harrowing escape from the research facility. As they spoke, Rhea listened intently, occasionally interjecting with questions or clarifications. By the time they finished, the gravity of the situation was clear to everyone in the room. "So these factions," Rhea said, tapping a finger on the table. "They're after the child because they think they can harness its abilities. And if they succeed, they'll have the power to destabilize entire systems," Sandra finished. "Maybe even more. We can't let that happen." Rhea nodded, her expression grim. "Agreed, but going up against them head-on is suicide. We need to be smart about this." Zephyr leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "What do you suggest?" Rhea pulled up a series of data points on the holo display, each one representing key locations where their enemies were likely operating. "We hit them where it hurts. Disrupt their operations, cut off their supply lines, and expose their plans to the wider galaxy. If we can make it too costly for them to continue the pursuit, they might back off." "But that won't stop them forever," Sandra pointed out. "They'll regroup, come after us with more force." "True," Rhea conceded, "but it'll buy us time. Time to figure out how to neutralize a threat for good. And in the meantime, we keep the child hidden, keep moving." Zephyr glanced at the child, who was now awake and watching the conversation with wide, curious eyes. "And what about the child? It's been through enough already. We can't keep dragging it from one danger to another." Rhea's gaze softened as she looked at the child. "I've got a place in mind. A sanctuary, deep in uncharted space. No one knows about it except for me and a few trusted allies. The child can recover there, safe from harm." Zephyr felt a wave of relief wash over him. A sanctuary sounded like exactly what the child needed, a place where it could heal, away from the dangers that had plagued its life so far. "But we'll need to move quickly," Rhea continued. "The longer we stay here, the more likely it is that they'll find us." Sandra nodded in agreement. "Then we should start preparing. We can't afford any mistakes." Rhea stood up, her expression resolute. "I'll get my crew ready. We'll leave at first light." As they began to finalize their plans, Zephyr couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was still gathering, but the worst was yet to come. But for now, they had a plan, allies they could trust, and a chance to keep the child safe. And that, Zephyr knew, was worth fighting for. As the meeting concluded and everyone went to make preparations, Zephyr lingered in the briefing room, his thoughts racing. He knew they were in for a long, hard fight, but with Sandra, Rhea, and the child by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The storm was coming, but this time they would be ready.